You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Hywel Davis. Today's debate is on poverty in Britain. By most measures, Britain's economy is the sixth largest in the world, and one that's now seeing stronger growth than almost all of its European partners. But the UK continues to be plagued by the problem of poverty. The Child Poverty Action Group says at least 3.5 million children, more than 25% of all children in the UK, live in poverty. Poverty figures have become a political football, beset by varying definitions, so it's hard to definitively say if poverty is getting worse. Organisations like the Trussell Trust say the use of food banks, almost unknown a decade ago, has soared. The Trust said over 250,000 people used them last year. The government, for its part, says there are now more people than ever before in work, which it says is the key to lifting people out of poverty. It also points out that raising the lower tax threshold is helping the lower paid retain more of their income. But despite those assurances, worries still remain that poverty is about to get worse, with campaigners warning that cuts to benefits are set to hit hard next year and the year after. I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Jane Wills from Queen Mary, University of London, Ben Southwood, Head of Macro Policy at the think tank the Adam Smith Institute, Sarah Lyle, researcher at the New Economics Foundation, and down the line we have Neil Cooper, Director of Church Action on Poverty. If I might start with you, Sarah, do we actually know whether poverty is getting worse or not in this country? This is surely a pretty important question.
Well, we know we can look at the statistics and we can look at experience on the ground. And as a think tank, we actually do research where we speak to people on the ground and we discuss their experience of poverty. And our findings are that poverty is intensifying and that also it's being experienced by a broader groups of people than may be expected. So that people who are unemployed are experiencing poverty, but also those who are in work.
Ben, you think that because the government's saying that more people are now in work, that actually it's getting at least slightly better?
Not necessarily. We're only just coming to a recovery right now. Real wages have been falling for 5 years. GDP per capita has been falling for 5 years. The size of the economy is significantly smaller than at the start of the recession. And if you compare it to its pre-recession trend, where it would be if we hadn't had a recession and carried on as normal, it's about 15%, perhaps even more below. So no, I don't think that we should expect that poverty would be better now. Having said that, the official measure of poverty has actually gone down during the recession because it's based on what the median person is earning, and median earnings have gone down, which perhaps is a problem with relative poverty measures when that happens.
Because the official measure is 60% of median wages. So if you have more people getting poorer, then the median wage drops down.
It looks like there are fewer people in poverty when, in fact, there aren't necessarily.
Jane Wills, there's a definitive answer here. Is it because we've had a recession that more people are in poverty, absolute poverty, rather than relative poverty?
That's a tricky question, but what has definitely been happening is this downward pressure on wages for a whole variety of reasons, alongside increasing costs. So for the last few years, there has been a real intensification of pressure on wages. And that now means that about 1 in 5 workers in the UK gets less than a living wage. So this whole mantra about work being the route out of poverty is now in question. Because if you go to work and you work 40 hours a week and you're not getting a living wage, you're still in poverty at the end of that week, particularly if you've got children to support. So in a sense, we need to look at what's happening at the lower end of the labour market and why people go to work and they still end up poor at the end of the week. And as I say, it's 1 in 5 of the British workforce now.
Could you just explain what the living wage is? This is an international audience, they might not know exactly what it is and how it differs from the minimum wage.
Yeah, well, the national minimum wage was brought in 1999, and that has a low pay commission. Really, it's about economics, number crunching, saying at what level can wages be set before we start to lose jobs. So it's really a wage that's in relation to what the market will bear. It's a market-led wage, and at the present time it's £6.31 an hour. Now, the living wage is a completely different calculation. It's saying, what do you need to live? So what's the cost of housing, transport, childcare, council tax, a basket of goods? And this is done through something called the minimum income standard research. And then all that's put into a computer and say, what's the hourly rate of pay you need to earn if you're not going to be in poverty at the end of the week? And that at the present time is £8.80 an hour in London and £7.65 an hour outside London in the rest of the country. So you can see there's a big gap between the minimum wage and the living wage. And over the past decade or so, there's been a campaign to try and encourage employers and organisations that can afford it, so the big players, to sign up to the living wage so that they bring up the wages of their workers at the bottom end in things like cleaning, catering, care, security.
And how successful has that campaign been?
It's been remarkably successful in difficult circumstances. When everyone said it was a crazy idea a decade ago, it was never going to work, it's slowly built up and has got more and more support. And there's now 600 employers who've accredited to the living wage, which means they've hand on heart signed a legal document saying that everybody in their employment and their contracting chain significantly is paid a living wage. And as a result of that, they can then use a logo to put on their branding, on their shop doors, on their emails and so on, to say we are an ethical employer. The theory is that you would then mobilise the marketplace so that people can shop and buy living wage to support an ethical employer, very much like fair trade has done. So it's trying to intervene into the market to support employers who are paying better wages at the bottom end, to try and tackle this question of in-work poverty.
If I might go to Neil Cooper, do you see sort of increasing levels of poverty where you are?
What we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years is the growth in numbers of people going to food banks. Churches all across the UK, not just in the kind of traditional centres of poverty, urban centres, but increasingly in suburban and wealthy parts of the country, setting up food banks. What they see is responding to a need of people that simply haven't got enough money at the end of the week to buy food and put it on their tables. Trussell Trust are the main provider, but last year we estimated more than 500,000 people had to use food banks. And that number's gone up dramatically again since April, when many of the welfare reforms and the cuts to people's benefit incomes have started to come through. So there's a huge growth in people literally going hungry.
And do you think that policies like the living wage would do a lot to help people get out of poverty, or can we just not afford it in austerity Britain?
Well, I don't see the living wage, at least as Jane has talked about it, as a policy, so much as it's something in the market like fair trade that you can use to raise wages. Having said that, I think if our goal is higher earnings for those at the low end of the spectrum, which is a very admirable goal, then it might be better to simply raise them out of tax and national insurance. If everyone on the minimum wage was out of tax and national insurance, then they would earn almost exactly the same amount as the living wage with tax and national insurance. So I think that might be one easier way of not risking any jobs, but nevertheless delivering the same pay packet to those like badly off people's homes.
Well, the government has been doing that, has been raising the tax threshold, but there does seem to be some pushback against that now. We've had Lord Lawson, for example, coming out saying that perhaps the upper rate of tax should be raised instead.
There has, but I think we should raise the lower threshold.
Sarah, do you think what the government has done in raising the tax threshold has actually had a significant effect, or is it really just too early to say yet?
I don't think it has had the best kind of effect. The problem with getting rid of national insurance contributions and bringing people out of tax is that actually poverty is a dynamic phenomenon. So it's not just one group of people who are in poverty. We're all at risk of being in poverty in different periods during our lives, depending on how many children we have, old age, illness, and actually national insurance contributions provide the protection for those times. So it isn't a sustainable solution, and I don't think it deals with the root causes of poverty. I think it would just be alleviating its worst effects in quite a downstream way.
Professor Willis, what are the root causes of poverty that we know of? There are many and they're complicated, but sort of a broad brush picture.
The most obvious one is low wages, if you can't earn enough to get yourself out of poverty. But the other ones, historically, of course, were old age. So if you went back 50, 60, well, maybe more now years, but before the welfare state really kicked off, it was elderly people who were poor, who were then outside the labour market.
Which isn't true at the moment, is it?
No.
Pensioners seem to be doing quite well at the moment.
Yeah,
compared to other
because pensioner benefits have been protected and the pension's actually been increased, which is a great thing for pensioners. But the other thing historically, which was always a factor, of course, was ill health and disability. And that's now in question because of the changes in welfare entitlements and so on around disability. But at the moment, I think the pressing issue in Britain is low wages. Because if wages don't get you out of poverty, we've got a massive crisis as a society, because it might make more sense to sit at home on the dole than go to work. And then that costs society a huge amount of money, not just in the benefits that are paid, but then what happens to the children, their sense of work ethic, their sense of what the future holds for them. There's a kind of whole host of psychological and social effects of parking people on benefits long term. And although everyone kind of moralises about that, if the wages are so low that it doesn't make sense to get out of bed in the morning, then that's the critical problem we have to face.
That's one of the key things the government is trying to do, is trying to get people off benefits into work.
And universal credit, in theory at least, is meant to make sure that you can never earn less on benefits than you would in work. But of course it's really complicated, because if you've got large numbers of children or you're a single parent, you can't just leave people with nothing to eat. And so either the state steps into that space, which is what's happened in the post-war period, or the charity sector steps in, and that's what's happening with the food banks and so on. So it is an issue we all have to face.
Well, Bev, what steps do you think we can take to actually try and reduce poverty, whether it's people earning low wages or whether people stuck on benefits?
There are loads and loads of things we can do, but the things I think most important are planning, monetary policy and welfare reform. I think the best thing we can do on welfare reform is universal basic income or a negative income tax. They're just two names for the same policy. Basically just give people condition-free money, because lack of money is the main cause of poverty. And then, I mean, this is kind of what Ian Duncan Smith's trying to do with the universal credit. It's just a more complicated version of it. But you withdraw that at a steady rate, just like a tax. It's an implicit tax. And that means that there's always a steady incentive to do extra hours, for example. And there's no knife-edge cut-off points where all your benefits go if you move or if you take a job or do an extra hour of work a week. No cut-off points, it's a nice steady flow. Planning is extremely important. The reason why rents are eating up, say, half of the low-paid incomes in London particularly, but also elsewhere. The reason rents are so high is because we're not building enough houses. We don't have enough places to house people. The reason we don't have enough houses is because we're not letting people build any houses. If we moved the green belt out 1 mile, we'd have space for 1 million more houses. If we removed the restrictions on usage and density and view restrictions inside of London, we'd have space perhaps another 1 million houses. This is what we need to do to make people's costs go down. And then finally, monetary policy has been run too tight during the recession. We need more demand in the economy, basically. That means the Bank of England should have been more aggressive. If we could do all of those things, then if you have a growing economy, if you have a functional welfare system, and if you build enough houses, then you can get rid of so much of poverty. I think those three together explain a very large fraction of the poverty that we see.
Sarah, do you think any of that is worth picking up?
I think the basic income may be worth exploring. I think we need to tackle poverty at the root cause, and I think the major way of doing that is addressing the widening inequalities, especially income inequalities, but also disparities in wealth and how it's owned within the country. So over the last, just to give you an idea, over the past decade, the ratio between the average pay for a chief executive and their average employee has gone up from 47 to 1 to 128 to 1. So chief execs are being paid 128 times that of their average employee. And actually, if you look at cleaners and chief executives, then they're being paid 250 times the cleaner's wage. And then in wealth, the richest 10% of the population own 100 times as much wealth, much of the national wealth, as the bottom 10%. And if we fail to tackle inequality, then we're never going to actually prevent poverty, even if we get GDP growth, in fact.
So how do you tackle inequality? Do you wholesale reforms to the taxation system, for example?
That could be part of it. Also reforming the labour market, which involves looking at pay, looking at skills. And then other kind of preventative measures, such as publicly funded childcare, which has been shown to be a really effective both social and economic investment in our infrastructure.
Neil Cooper, do you think the people you're working with feel that an unequal society is the one that they're based in an unequal society, and that's one of the things that really hurts about poverty?
I think it is. Living in a wealthy society where you can see conspicuous wealth, and the marketing that's done through all kinds of media, people are bombarded with images of wealth, and yet living on the breadline, that's part of the reality that people live with. And part of the anger that people then feel about things like bankers' bonuses, that we're being told that there isn't any money, and there's no money for public services, there's no money to increase even basic state benefits in line with inflation. And yet people at the top seem to abide by a different set of rules. So absolutely, I think tackling inequality is the big picture game. What we've seen over the economic boom time was a significant portion of the growth went into the pockets of those that were already wealthy. And if we're getting back now to a time where we're looking at new economic growth, that growth has got to be directed more into the pockets of kind of ordinary working people. So the issue about wage inequality and income inequality and asset inequality, the house housing market is massively dysfunctional, and that's part of the issue that's been referred to, that rents are incredibly high, and that's also now a cost to government, that the housing benefit bill is 15 or 20 billion pounds a year. That's simply going, a large part of that, into the pockets of private landlords who are reaping profits hand over fist. People on low incomes aren't benefiting from that. In fact, it's part of what traps them in poverty. So there's a whole raft of measures that need to be taken to tackle income inequality and wealth inequality.
Ben, come in.
The Gini coefficient, which is obviously the most widely used and I'd say one of the best, but actually does have some weird statistical elements. Yeah, but has gone down significantly since the crisis. And
but that's because all wages have gone down, isn't it, rather than because we're getting less unequal?
Well, no, it's because the people who've lost the most income since the recession of the top 10%. So inequality's gone down substantially since 2008 to a point not seen since the 90s. So while I'm absolutely cool with saying that, you know, inequality is a problem, perhaps I don't necessarily agree, and that we should take steps to reduce it and so on, we shouldn't base that on a dubious claim that it's going up recently.
OK, but we can say in the last 20 years it's gone up, can we not?
We can definitely say that since 1979 it's gone up massively, but in the last 20 years it's been about flat.
Well, I think one of the big things is the change in the labour market, because what's happened in the last, like Ben says, since sort of late 70s, there's been a massive shift in the kind of jobs we've got in our labour market. So there's been a growth in the top end in professional jobs, law, finance, accounting, media, kind of top end jobs which require degrees. And then there's been a growth at the very bottom end in very routine service jobs, shelf stacking, but particularly things like care and some sort of call centre type jobs. And what's happened is there's been a falling out in the middle, which was sort of solid job for life, working class jobs in things like administration or clerical work for women, but also factory jobs and manufacturing. And they were jobs that weren't seen as good jobs, but they were unionised often, or there was a kind of a sense of them being there for the long term with benefits. They were living wage jobs in effect. And so this is the kind of underpinnings of our economy, has been this growth at the top and bottom end of the labour market, and that has fuelled the inequality that Sarah was talking about. And that's happening not just in this country but everywhere. So you've had this kind of polarisation, and you've had downward pressure on wages, particularly for those at the bottom, and you put them together and inequality's exploded. Not least because the elite of the labour market are global, and they're comparing their salaries to New York and Tokyo, and they're moving from Princeton and business schools into big top jobs, and they very much operate at a global level. So the labour market's completely changed since the late 1970s, and inequality, I fear, is here to stay. It's like it's embedded in this type of economy, and we have to think about the best ways we can help to make sure that people are out of poverty. That would be my thing. Inequality is a problem, not least because it fuels the housing market, which then has massive costs for all of us. But I think the main policy focus should be on those in the bottom end.
Sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, just to come in on what Jane's saying there, our research in Islington here in London has suggested that by 2020, many of the people on middle incomes will have been forced out of the area due to the kind of above average increases in local house prices, which is being driven by wealthier people moving into the area, pushing up the price of the cost of living there. I mean, that's saying that by 2020, people who are nurses and teachers won't be able to live there, and we'll be left with the chief execs, the brokers, the sales directors.
Neil, does that sound slightly London-centric for you, even if in Manchester?
Yes, I think London is a special case, and the degree of inequality in London is probably far greater than anywhere else in the country. But there is a London effect, which is that the huge amount of wealth in London distorts the London economy, but then that has a knock-on effect for the rest of the UK. And things like house prices are massively distorted by the spending power of a wealthy 5 or 10% of the population. So I don't think it's possible to actually tackle poverty without looking at reducing the distorting impact of wealth on the whole economy. That's what's driving up house prices. That's what's having an eroding impact on the distribution of wages within companies and across companies. So I think there do have to be some serious thought as to how, as I've said, the economic growth can be shared more equally, and a pushback against some of the management techniques which have come into business over the past 20 or 30 years, which are all about driving down costs at the bottom, which means driving down wages, and at the same time paying professional and senior staff increasing ridiculous salaries. And I think unless we can address that, then within companies and within the economy as a whole, the share of growth will continue to go to those at the top, and people at the bottom will flatline.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Hywel Davis, and today's debate is on poverty in Britain. I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Jane Wills from Queen Mary, University of London, Ben Southwood, Head of Macro Policy at the think tank the Adam Smith Institute, Sarah Lyle, researcher at the New Economics Foundation, and down the line we have Neil Cooper, Director of Church Action on Poverty. Ben, you've talked about relaxing restrictions on the Greenbelt, for example. It's interesting how the discussion has become about housing quite quickly.
It's so important.
It is. But do you think that's actually, it's a long-term thing that will happen? And B, do you think the government's doing enough? They've said they will relax some restrictions.
They're doing nothing. Seriously, and the major policy they've introduced on housing is Help to Buy, which is making the whole thing much worse. It's boosting house prices without necessarily leading to any extra house building, and it hits renters really bad because they don't get any of the extra money or guarantees that are given to people who are buying houses, up to £600,000, but they get all of the extra rise in housing costs. So no, the government's doing absolutely nothing really to help this issue. Nick Bowles, I think, would like to do stuff on this, but I mean, the Conservative Party's constituency is people who don't want to see more houses built, so it's very unlikely you would see them do anything on this issue. But basically what we need is liberalised planning. There's loads of different ways to get this. I just used the Greenbelt example because people don't really know how much Greenbelt there is compared to how little houses there are. About 4.9% of the UK is taken up by buildings, okay, and about another 4.9% for gardens, and then 13.7% of the whole UK is taken up by greenbelts. So, greenbelts are much bigger than, or are using up a lot more space than houses, and just 1 mile into the massive greenbelt around London would allow 1 million houses. Now, 1 million houses isn't enough. We need way more than that. People want to live in London, so we should make more London. Basically, the best way to do that is just make everything in London more dense. If you look at Paris, the centre of Paris is much smaller than London, but has about the same number of people, because in 1870 they redesigned it to make it much more dense. Now, I'm not saying that we get one guy to rebuild the whole of London, but we can allow that to patchwork happen. And I don't think it's true at all to say that the reason rents in London are high and house prices in London are high are because of the damaging effects of financial sector or of inequality or anything like that. The reason rents in London are high is we're building historically low numbers of houses, whereas it's a very desirable place to live and people across the world are coming.
We've done some research that's shown that actually there is a link between people not building houses and the inequality, because if housing prices are just increasing, then there isn't so much of an incentive for
You're absolutely
builders.
right. I totally agree. No, sorry, I don't. I thought you were going to say that because rich people don't want more houses to be built near them because it makes their house go down in value. I think that's a very important factor. But actually,
no, it's that if you keep the housing stock as it is and housing prices are just going up and up and up, then you know that you can rent out the properties or sell those properties at very high charges. So there's not really incentive to build new housing stock. And I think the issue with what you're saying as well is that we do need to think about the geographical picture and the need to invest not just here in the southeast, but to be investing in the north of the country as well.
I mean, I care about people, not places. So I think that if the best way to make someone better off is them to come and get a good job in London, whether they're coming from, the rest of Europe, whether they're coming from Romania, whether they're coming from the north, I don't care where they're coming from. I just want them to be well off. So I'm quite happy to have London absorb all the development if that means everyone gets better off. And
that doesn't mean everybody gets better off.
It might do.
Not for the rest of the UK. As I said, there's a massive distorting effect. London is completely overheating, and at the same time, investment is being sucked out of large parts of the rest of the UK. So I think there needs to be a UK perspective and not a London perspective. That growth and investment needs to be spread much more widely, rather than just seeing London as the centre for all economic growth in the UK. That will become increasingly unsustainable if it's just sucking money and resources and people from the rest of the country. That's not how most other European countries work. They have a number of centres of economic growth. Germany, the strongest country in Europe, doesn't have one huge all-encompassing capital. It has very strong regional centres. And that's not just about the jobs and housing, it's also about economic growth strategies. That if we're going to tackle poverty, we need economic growth across the UK that reaches communities that are 200 miles from London that see no benefits from growth happening in London.
Professor Wells, it's a fairly depressing picture then we're painting here of a country which is dominated by the fairly wealthy southeast and the regions aren't getting anything, an economy where the middle-ranking wages have mostly been sucked away. Is there any grounds for optimism at all that we can do anything?
Yeah, well, actually, Neil just mentioned Germany, and that's interesting because Germany's got a very strong regional economy and it's got regional institutions, so it's got banks that lend to local businesses and a kind of rich institutional culture that facilitates economic growth. So if you imagine places like Manchester, there's loads of talent there, there's loads of exciting, innovating people. If we could foster a stronger regional institutional culture with more freedom for local institutions, say like banks to set up, to lend to local businesses, I think we've got a great future. Not least because you see the return sometimes now of companies that's previously offshored a lot of those middle range jobs because it was cheaper to send them to China. Now with increasing transport costs, concern about the environment, wage costs going up in other parts of the world, there's a chance for some of that production to come back to these strong regional economies, which we still have a kind of vestige of our manufacturing past and traditions, which I think could be reborn in the 21st century. So there is actually a lot going for this country. We can't just put everything in the southeast, not least because people don't want, mobility is very damaging. If we expect everybody to move to the southeast and then, send money back home to Manchester or Sheffield, it's incredibly destructive to us, our communities, and the way in which people live and have children and support each other over generations in places. So we do need a different model. I'm not sure that it's very easy for government in Westminster to decide how all this is going to happen. We have to somehow foster this much more localised, regional, institutional richness that you see in countries like Germany so that we can have more innovation, more growth and more poverty-reducing jobs outside London.
Do you see much sign of that actually sort of taking hold in Westminster? Westminster, which seems to cling quite closely to all its powers.
Well, the rhetoric of the coalition agreement is very interesting. The opening paragraph is all about how this is going to be the first ever government that leaves office with less power than it came in with. I mean, that's what it says in the opening paragraph. And a lot of the language has been around localism and regional innovation, and even manufacturing has come back on the agenda. So there's a lot of rhetoric there, but I think it always is hard for ministers to let go. And Whitehall does always think it knows best. But at least there's a kind of willingness now to move away from more technocratic Westminster central solutions and try and untap the innovative potential and capacity of British citizens, which is great.
And I might put the same question to the rest of you. Are there any grounds for optimism that perhaps we can get over poverty here in this country, to at least some extent?
I think we need to reclaim the heritage of this country as being a place that has a strong welfare state and a healthy labour market that allows us to not only alleviate poverty but actually prevent it. And I think there are grounds for optimism there. I mean, I think the British public actually do support not acting solely as kind of autonomous individuals, but working together to create a sort of stable, equitable society. And there's evidence from that in the British Social Attitudes Survey that I've just been doing some work on. That makes me feel optimistic. And I think there are things we can do to move towards a much more preventative approach, which on the kind of coalition terms, the terms of the current government, would actually be more cost effective as well.
Ben, are you optimistic that we can do more to get rid of poverty?
Yes, I think that if we defined poverty how we defined it 100 years ago, then we've already solved poverty.
Well, absolute terms. So we're no longer living like Victorians.
I think actually,
pretty low level to start from, no?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the Victorians wouldn't have agreed, but Adam Smith said that relative poverty is what matters, and so in the Adam Smithian tradition, I agree. Relative poverty is what matters, but we can't just care about relative poverty because then we can never beat poverty so long as we don't have pure equality, and that's just never going to happen. But I am optimistic. I think that we'll devise loads of great technologies that will mean that everyone has comfortable, happy lives.
And Neil, you're perhaps closest to the coalface there. Do you feel that there may be some grounds for optimism on poverty in the UK?
I'm afraid I'm going to finish with a slightly more pessimistic note. I mean, I think the reality is that, as I've said, hundreds of thousands of people are now on the breadline, literally struggling to make ends meet. And I don't see the political will to make the large-scale changes and to challenge some of the vested interests that are resistant to what needs to happen. I think that for me the sign of hope is that there is an increasing sense of anger, I think, at what's happening. And if that can be turned into political pressure for change, then maybe. But it's tough out there, and I don't see things improving in the near future for people that are currently experiencing destitution and poverty.
And on that note, I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much to my guests, Professor Jane Wills from Queen Mary University of London, Ben Southwood, Head of Macro Policy at the Adam Smith Institute, Sarah Lyle, Researcher at the New Economics Foundation, and Neil Cooper, Director of Church Action on Poverty. Thank you all very much.